Thanks, everyone. I hope folks had a good lunch. My name is Mitch Fraas. I'm one of the curators here, and wanted to add my thanks to everyone else, to Lynn and John and Severe and Michael and the whole, Tony, the whole organizing committee of the conference. And it's been great to have the exhibit here. I've been, at least last week, the week before, steering people up here, and I think it's going to be amazing to have up for the next couple months to have people see the material manifestations of Swift's work. Without further ado, because we're running just a little bit late, I will turn it over to our two speakers, whose bios are in the program, but I'll say briefly that Cecilia Feilla is our first speaker from Marymount, Manhattan, and is introducing me to the word pathognomies, pathognomies of laughter and national identity, Swift among the Black humorists, and she'll be followed by Elizabeth Hedrick from the University of Texas, Austin, on Form and Attack, Swift's Use of Cicero in a Modest Proposal. So, Cecilia.
Thank you for that, and good afternoon, and I would like to add my thank yous to the organizers and to the speakers. This has been a truly wonderful symposium, and I'm delighted to be part of it. So I do want to make a clarification before I start, and surprisingly not the word pathognomies, but actually Black humorists. And I just wanted to make clear that I'm talking about l'humour noir, the French term by André Breton, the French surrealist. And so it is not a term with a racial designation, not a comic form associated with Black peoples or Black traditions. Rather, the focus of my talk today is on Swift's reception in France, and by way of France, later in America in the 20th century. In each case, I will compare in particular how Swift is paired with Voltaire in a rivalry between Black humor and satire, and will examine the role that laughter, and more specifically the pathognomy of laughter, plays in determining who represents which mode of humor. This particular thread of Swift's influence begins in October 1937 in Paris at a small literary conference, not unlike this one, that took place under the banner Black Humor, l'humour noir. Okay. Voila. And so this is the catalog to that conference that was organized by André Breton as a platform for the surrealists, and more specifically to launch his latest literary project, the Anthology of Black Humor, which would be published 3 years later in 1940. And ever since David Alf's talk on projects yesterday morning, I can't help but see Breton as a Gallic cucumber man. He launched this anthology project to make money. However, the book was banned even before it came out, and he barely earned a penny from it. The 1937 conference consisted of a talk by Breton on Black humor and readings by leading French actors of 13 of what would become 45 entries in the published anthology. And here's where Jonathan Swift comes in. He holds pride of place both among the 13 in 1937, and in fact, in the catalog that I just showed you in two previous slides, a portrait of his is published in the program. And he is the first entry in the published anthology. He's represented in the anthology by the works Directions to Servants, A Modest Proposal, A Meditation Upon a Broomstick, and 17 Aphorisms. And here is the table of contents in Breton's hand. You can see Swift at the top. HN refers to humour noir. In the introductory note that Breton wrote for the entries, he explains the choice of Swift and his importance to the volume thusly. When it comes to Black humor, everything designates Swift as the true originator. Now, this might seem self-evident to us now, since Black humor is a familiar term, but not so in 1937 and 1940. It has become familiar largely because Breton coined and defined the concept, and in some ways the project was too successful, if not financially so, in that the term Black humor was subsequently taken up by numerous other writers existentialists, writers of the absurd, the Black humorists in America of the 1960s, and so on, that it became less and less associated with Breton, as we will see momentarily. In 1937, that conference was the first public use of the term Black humor. He'd been using it since 1916, but this was his coming out. For Breton, Swift reflected the superior revolt of the mind he associated with Black humor. The very choice of an Irishman over a compatriot embodies and announces this spirit of revolt, meant to be a slap in the face to convention and the French establishment. In this vein, Breton bypasses Rabelais and Voltaire, undeniably two of France's great humorists, in favor of Swift. The anthology, as you see, contains 45 entries, 43 Europeans and 2 American writers, and represents a wide array of genres and styles, some satirical, some not. Aphorisms, poetry by Baudelaire, fiction by Kafka, musings by Marcel Duchamp and Salvador Dali, and the 2 Americans included are Edgar Allan Poe and O. Henry. The anthology is, in fact, a surrealist manifesto of sorts, its spirit adversarial and playful, meant to jolt, particularly with its inclusion of non-canonical text, in many cases from the underbelly of mainstream popular French culture, and many of the names are completely unknown, except to specialists today. The anthology, Breton is articulating a literary genealogy leading to surrealism. Indeed, in the 1924 Surrealist Manifesto, he named Swift as an accidental surrealist, a surrealist of malice. And though perhaps it would be perverse to demand a rational unifying principle from a surrealist, I think if we can find one in the anthology, it lies in this notion of noir, black, and its specific inflections in French. Whereas the term humour in French, humor in English, is in fact an English word adopted, untranslated into French, noir has a particular history in France that I'm going to detail here. According to Germaine de Stael in her On Literature from 1800, the English language created this word, humor, to express that gaiety that is a disposition of the blood, almost as much as of the spirit. It draws from the natural climate and the national mores of England. Stael cites the works of Swift and Fielding as examples, and especially of Sterne. Now, the modifier noir, by contrast, is an aesthetic adjective with a long history in French literature, one that extends back to the late 18th century. In French, noir means black or dark. As in English, it has secondary meanings and connotations of morbid or grim or macabre. The application of the term noir to literature first appeared in the 18th century in reference to British Gothic novels that were flooding the continent in the 1780s and 90s. These novels, known as romans noirs, or black novels, reached a zenith of popularity during the years of the French Revolution. The Marquis de Sade, who is included in Breton's anthology, number 2, argued that the Gothic novel was, quote, the indispensable product of the revolutionary jolts experienced by all of Europe, end quote. André Breton similarly identified the French Revolution as responsible for the flowering of the noir genre, which he considered, quote, the pathognomic, he likes adjectives, of the large-scale social trouble that took hold of Europe at the end of the 18th century. Pathognomique is a medical term from the Greek for pathos, suffering, or malady, and gnome for judgment or spirit, and indicates a sign or symptom that allows one to diagnose an underlying illness. Thus, Gothic fiction is the sign or expression of the large-scale social malady, as Breton says, that took hold of Europe during the French Revolution. Pathognomy is the science of the signs by which the human passions are indicated, and I'm going to be looking at the correspondence between the medical and a term that I believe the first use of pathognomy is in Lavater's Physiognomy, and he makes a distinction between physiognomy and pathognomy. Now, of course, Sade and Breton get it somewhat wrong. The Gothic revival in literature began well before 1789 in Germany, England, and even to some extent in France. However, what Sade and Breton are identifying is a particular sensibility or revolt or shift that inflects noir aesthetics in France in response to the events of war and devastation, and reminds us that Breton's reflections on Black humor cannot be dissociated from the bloody politics and wars of the early 20th century. Indeed, between 1937 and the publication of the Anthology in 1940, World War had broken out again and France was under occupation. The Vichy government was installed. Breton was banned, and by extension, Swift. The jolt of revolution and the Black or Gothic genre it produced were seen by Breton as establishing a metaphysics of the nightmare. In the 1924 Surrealist Manifesto, Breton had lauded Matthew Lewis's novel The Monk as, quote, wonderful, unforgettable, admirable, a model of innocent grandeur, end quote. He also praised Horace Walpole, Charles Maturin, and Clara Reeve, and felt a particular affinity with the common trope among Gothic writers that their tales originated in dreams, which Breton saw as closely related to the surrealist notion of automatic writing he was developing. And so in many ways, through the Anthology of Black Humor, Breton was suggesting that the Gothic impulse in his day was found in surrealism. It was the pathognomonique, in French, of the malady of his own time. As French scholar Catherine Lanour writes, Breton redeemed the Gothic in a new era of doubt and darkening political prospects. For this reason, critic Janine Plotel has suggested that a specifically Gothic quality unifies the selections in Breton's Anthology of Black Humor, and she offers Gothic humor, rather than Black humor, as the more apt term. At first, Plotel's assertion gives pause, particularly since Jonathan Swift is the figure Breton identifies as the initiator of the genre, a figure who is difficult to reconcile with the Gothic sensibility. However, the connection of Gothic and satire can be made. For example, John Clarke reminds us in his book, The Modern Satiric Grotesque and Its Traditions, that the Gothic, in its roots to the Goths, represented the disorder and barbarity that threatened civilization. Quote, man's highest attainments could at any moment come tumbling down as had the grandeur that was Rome. A near apocalyptic tie of barbarism could initiate dark ages when least expected. Clarke notes that the way in which writers such as Jonathan Swift often appeal to culture's decline and the potential reinfestation of society by savages, and so the inverse of Enlightenment optimism, neoclassicism, and rationalism, I think can help us illuminate the Gothic sensibility that underlies Breton's concept of humour noir, and how Swift is a fitting founding father. As a genre, the Gothic strips away the conventionality of reality and civilization to explore the irrational, the grotesque, the repressed, the savage, and so on. And on a deeper level is a drama of the tenuous relationship between reality and perception, order and chaos, civilization and barbarity. So now let's return to Breton, who post-World War I was acutely aware of the barbarity of civilization, and what he says about Swift in the preface to the book. He starts by rejecting Voltaire's claim that Swift was, quote, a perfected Rabelais. According to Breton, Swift, quote, shared to only the smallest degree Rabelais' taste for innocent, heavy-handed jokes and his constant drunken good humor, end quote. In the same way, he writes, Swift stood opposite Voltaire in his entire way of reacting to the spectacle of life, end quote. And here Breton takes as the emblem of this difference between Swift and Voltaire the emblem of the death masks of both men. So Voltaire's death mask, he writes, bears a perpetual snicker. And ever since the sculpture by Houdon, the famous sculpture of Voltaire, who will forever be in his 70s or 80s in everyone's mind, because that's when that famous sculpture was made, and people always comment on Voltaire's kind eyes and his cruel mouth, right? The mouth of the satirist, the kind eyes of the reformer. And so here, Breton specifies the perpetual snicker the mask of a man who grasped things by reason and never by feeling, and who enclosed himself in skepticism. The other, he writes, meaning Swift, impassive, glacial. Is the mask of a man who grasped life in a wholly different way and who was constantly outraged. Thus, Breton associates Voltaire with satire and the winking, snickering wit of French court culture, which he rejects. Swift, by contrast, is the inventor of savage or gallows humor, because he remained a grim and sorrowful voice of savage indignation, from his famous epitaph. Quote, "The profoundly singular turn of his mind," writes Breton, "inspired in him, Swift, a series of diversions and reflections on the order of the ladies' dressing room and the meditation upon a broomstick, which partake of a remarkably modern spirit and are responsible for the fact that perhaps no body of work is less out of date." Finally, Breton repeats the saying that Swift provokes laughter but does not share in it. Here, Breton is referencing Sigmund Freud's theories of dark humor in his essay Jokes in the Relation to the Unconscious from 1905, which Breton cites in the preface to the Anthology. Freud is particularly interested in gallows humor, a particular form of dark humor, the humor of the condemned man facing his death. And key in this mode of humor for Freud is the fact that the victims show no affect in the face of death or other grim truth, but makes a joke instead. Humor here displaces into laughter the psychic energy that would otherwise be expended in anger, pain, or horror, and is essentially a defense mechanism against death. Freud's example of dark or gallows humor is of a man being led to the gallows who asks the guard for a neckerchief because he doesn't want to catch a cold. The humor does not lie in the words, but in the man's reaction and attitude to his circumstances and to death, a situational humor. That is, his insistence on pleasure in the face of threatening reality, and this for Freud exemplifies the pleasure principle triumphing over the reality principle. For Freud, this type of humor is liberating, possessing grandeur and elevation, and a triumph of narcissism, the victorious assertion of the ego's invulnerability. The ego, he writes, refuses to be distressed by the provocations of reality, to let itself be compelled to suffer. It insists that it cannot be affected by the traumas of the external world. It was this liberatory, rebellious impulse that appealed to Breton. Of course, the influence of psychoanalysis on surrealism is well known. And here we cannot forget the importance of the onlooker experiencing the same feelings of pleasure and mastery despite the threatening nature of the situation, who is also spared the need to call up emotional impulses of despair, fear, horror, and participates in the same assertion of the ego's invulnerability. And in France, a friend of Breton, Achille Chavet, describes Swift's satire as the polite form of despair. However, Breton's black humor is not limited to gallows humor or the specific situation of facing death that underlies Freud's theories. Rather, what Breton takes as central from Freud is this pathognomy of laughter, or refusing to laugh. And so the facial expression of the human passions. And that for him, this is what divides traditional satire from black humor, Voltaire from Swift. And if satire, to generalize for a moment, critiques human vice and folly but maintains a sense of ordered reality, then satirists' sense of disappointment or despair is with human action, not with the world or reality itself. The reader, by implication, becomes complicit with, agrees to, the correct vision the author is putting forth. Black comedy, by contrast, does not maintain a belief in a knowable and meaningful universe. It is more existentialist and absurdist. Reality itself is made up of nothing but accident, meaninglessness, misfortune, and cruelty. The audience's laughter is not then, as in satire, complicit with the correct vision promoted by the satirist, but rather, according to Fidel Fajardo Acosta, the laughter of the audience betrays complicity in the problems the author seeks to expose. Hence, Breton's focus on Swift's refraining from laughter is superior to the snicker of Voltaire. In the time remaining, I will briefly turn to the American black humorists of the 1960s, and how the pathognomy of laughter outlined above is repeated, and Swift and Voltaire again provide the rival examples of Black humor and satire, although the binaries undergo a curious inversion in the voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. In 1964, Black humor moved to the forefront of literary criticism in the US, as critics sought to explain a new phenomenon in the American novel. In 1965, Bruce J. Friedman published an anthology of Black humor, a watershed collection that did not mention Breton and did not include any of the same authors from Breton's anthology, but I think we're going to see echoes of Breton. Incidentally, Breton died the next year. We can see in the advertisement on the right the names of the authors included, among them Thomas Pynchon, Joseph Heller, and John Barth, as well as two Europeans, Nabokov and Céline, comparable with Breton's two Americans, Poe and O. Henry. And on the left, we can see the cover, and it might be too small to see, but part of the dialogue bubble uses the term snicker in an echo of Breton's dismissal of Voltaire, the evil snicker, the bottom one, my darling evil snicker. And as we will see, they will embrace Voltaire over Swift. Attempting to name the strategies and spirit of this modern American writers and critics revived Breton's term, but also turned to the 18th century. The differences between Black humor and satire were hotly debated. Some argued that Black humor was an extreme form of satire, in which it assumes its most violent form, exceeding the bounds of ordinary decency. Bruce J. Friedman claimed that Black humor was beyond satire, sailing, as he put it, into darker waters than traditional satire, and the reference to sailing echoes the first line of Swift's epitaph. Swift has sailed into his rest. Meanwhile, the more old guard liberals, as Stephen Weisenberger puts it, complained that Black humor was not satirical enough. The rivalry of satire and Black humor is again vehicled in these debates through comparison of Voltaire and Swift. However, as already mentioned, the poles are reversed. For the American Black humorists, Swift was now the traditional satirist who they rejected, and Voltaire the Black humorist par excellence. And I'll just quote, as I move to a conclusion, Alan Pratt published a collected volume on Black humor, and he notes the central place of Voltaire in the criticism of and assessments of innovations in the American novel in the 1960s. And he writes, essays about Black humor, which include the past, often refer to Voltaire's Candide, and one can find it referenced in discussions of works by Céline, French, Heller, Barth, Pynchon, Vonnegut, and Southern, to name a few. It seems clear that Voltaire was wrestling with the same philosophical existential quandaries that are addressed in the 20th century literature of the absurd. Pratt identifies a clear genealogy of Black humor from Voltaire through Céline to the American novelists of the post-war era in terms of absurdism and existentialism, and further states that they depart from the historical line of satire from Swift. And at the time, Time magazine ran an article claiming that Black humor was the same kind of bitter laughter of juvenile Rabelais and Swift, a vigorous new outgrowth of satiric talent, contradicting, but most critics at the time used Swift actually as a benchmark for what Black humor was not. And so Alan Pratt argues that Voltaire is ultimately existentialist in Candide because he leaves readers in a metaphysical void with the tedium of work as the only solace. Instead of the zany, albeit black merriment which characterizes previous episodes, we are left with a mood of somber abdication, a mood altogether different from Vonnegut's ridiculousness. The Black humorist sees the absurd world as an outrageous joke with laughter, the only viable solution. In the end, Voltaire is not satisfied with laughing at the void. Instead, he grits his teeth. So according to the American Black humorists of the 60s then, Voltaire does not wear an eternal snicker, as Breton claimed, but rather grits his teeth. So what can this foray into the American and French response to Swift tell us about Black humor, satire, Swift? And by way of conclusion, I'm just going to I still have a number of questions myself, but I want to raise some issues tying us back to Breton. And that is that I think that following Breton, Black humor is less a fixed genre than a mode and symptom, a pathognomique of whatever the current malady is. It is the Gothic impulse made new. for a new era of doubt and darkening political prospects, such as our own, where gallows humor is fixed by situational specificity of the condemned, and satire is tethered to its engagement with a correct vision of the world and its aim to have an immediate corrective effect. Black humor has more poetic autonomy. The despair that gives blackness to Black humor suggests an affinity with nihilism, the condition or state of mind in which nothing appears to have value or meaning. Love, honor, fidelity are so many specious tokens in the marketplace of universal self-interest. Black humor thus enjoys a philosophical distinction beyond the reach of humor. It does not snicker, but roars as fitting the magnitude of its disappointment. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I should say that I'm glad I'm talking about Modest Proposal. I think if you're going to talk about Swift and Black humor, you probably couldn't pick a better example from Swift's canon to serve as an example of Black humor. One point I do want to make is that while I don't have any projected visuals, I do have a sort of low-tech course, which is a paper handout. So yeah, I think there's enough to go around, but there are a few extras hanging around if you'd like one. Okay. A Modest Proposal is undoubtedly the best known of Swift's short prose satires. The work's title has become a kind of touchstone for pugilistic essay writing. It's often invoked by bloggers and op-ed writers who are attempting to persuade their readers to entertain some idea or other that those readers might find offensive. But what some of us might occasionally forget, depending on what we teach and how often we teach it, is that Swift's essay is in no small part well known because it is often taught in lower division college writing classes and in writing classes at the secondary level as a model argumentative essay. A recently digitized ranking of the works to appear most often on college course syllabi in the US, this is a fascinating compilation called the Open Syllabus Project, places Swift's essay at number 118 of all titles listed. Now, the significance of this location is considerable when one remembers that in this context, A Modest Proposal is competing for preeminence with such works as Plato's Republic, The Communist Manifesto, and Hamlet, which are all in the top 10. The probability that Swift's essay is being taught so much because it is being presented in the context of writing instruction as opposed to some more narrowly literary interest is heightened by the fact that several guides to research and thesis writing, for example, Kate Turabian's works and the MLA Handbook, appear in the top 50 titles of the list. And in fact, the work that occupies the number 1 spot on the list as a whole, gratifyingly, if a little surprisingly maybe, is Strunk and White's The Elements of Style. So go Strunk and White. Yeah. Right. The rhetorical design of Swift's work, in other words, is crucial to what, by some measures, are the most widespread and influential ways of reading The Modest Proposal. Yet, as we all know, literary critics and historians, more narrowly defined, as well as students of 18th century Anglo-Irish culture, have had a lot to say about the proposal that has neglected its structure entirely. They may have examined the essay's structure on occasion, but they have not regarded doing so as essential to their professional remit as Swiftians. These two sharp differences of emphasis, I suggest, mark a small but important subdisciplinary fissure within English studies between students of rhetoric and composition on the one hand and literary critics and historians grouped together on the other. And in the remarks I want to make on Modest Proposal, I intend to work across this subdisciplinary divide by examining the implications of the Modest Proposal's classical form at a little greater length. Students of Swift's rhetoric, who seem to have been most active critically in the 1960s, so some years ago now, have done a lot to explain the structure of the Modest Proposal and the ways in which that structure contributes to Swift's ironic aims. In Swift's classical rhetoric, Charles Allen Beaumont emphasized that Swift's knowledge and use of classical rhetorical principles was firmly rooted in his training at both Kilkenny School and Trinity College, Dublin. One might also note that volumes of Cicero, along with those of Tacitus and Seneca, head the list of books by Latin prose writers in the Sale catalog of Swift's library. In his chapter on the Modest Proposal, Beaumont argues that Swift's essay has a 6-part structure that precisely reflects the one described by Cicero in Book 3 of De Oratore as necessary to persuasive oration. And here's where in the handout becomes a bit useful. as you can see, I've listed the form as Beaumont gives it of the Ciceronian persuasive argument, the various parts, and what they roughly do. For example, the proem is introduction, obviously, in which the speaker establishes his bona fides, his credentials, his ethos, if you want to call it that. Then the narration, general description of the subject, digression, which is kind of an optional part that can move around, the confirmatio, which is kind of the guts of the essay, bad metaphor to use in this context, I think, but excuse me. The body, most substantial part of the argument, the reprehensio, the part that refutes opposing positions, and then the peroration at the very end. This, by the way, I apologize if this is familiar, maybe even tediously familiar to some of you. That if you teach Swift as this piece as an argumentative model, you're likely to be familiar with this, but I hope to give a couple additional tweaks to this perspective that I hope will make it useful to you, at least in the first part of my remarks here. Then at the ends of these various part descriptions here, I give the paragraph numbers in the modest proposal that Beaumont assigns to them. In other words, he says, here's the essay, and it follows the Ciceronian format very clearly. Okay, I'll get to what's in Roman numeral 2 in just a second. Okay. Beaumont generally sees the structure of the proposal as a means for Swift to increase the distance between himself and his speaker. As he puts it, the classical form of the essay is itself an important constituent of Swift's irony, for the projector's addressing his readers through an ancient and learned form helps to allay any suspicion of radical newness. Beaumont regards the proposal's structure as representing positive values that Swift endorses, in other words, and as exposing the speaker's barbarism by way of contrast. His view is widespread among rhetorical analysts of Swift's work. Charles K. Smith follows Beaumont's lead, writing not long after him, to suggest that Swift's use of the Ciceronian template allows Swift to characterize his proposer as diligent, thoughtful, and conventional. It serves as a method of playing the proposer's careful control against the almost inconceivable perversion of his scheme. Well, analyses of this sort are extremely useful, especially if you're teaching this essay in a writing class, and they deserve sharpening and improving wherever possible. More specifically, I'd like to note a few points about Swift's use of Cicero that Beaumont doesn't really mention, starting with the fact that Swift doesn't just employ the Ciceronian format in the modest proposal and employ it very tautly, very rigidly. He does so with a pronounced degree of self-consciousness. He draws attention to the very fact that he's using it, even as he does so. For example, in the confirmatio section of the essay, Swift has his speaker literally enumerate the supposed advantages of his plan, first, secondly, thirdly, and so on, all the way through sixthly, as if to emphasize the status of the speaker's ideas as the assembled subheads of an argument. As his speaker makes a transition into the confirmatio, Swift has him explicitly point up the fact that he has just finished the digressio proper. The proposer states, as I'm sure you all recall, I have too long digressed and therefore shall return to my subject. And notice that the words point up the section that he's entering into or has just left. Swift even has his speaker announce that he is making his proposition early in the essay before he makes it. Here he says, I shall now therefore humbly propose my own thoughts, which I hope will not be liable to the least objection. This, by the way, is paragraph 8 in its entirety. It's only one sentence long. The pointedness of this particular moment is so literal, in fact, that it implies that Beaumont's delineation of Swift's template as purely Ciceronian needs a little bit of correcting. Paragraph 8, I'd suggest, together with the 8 paragraphs after it, that's numbers 8 through 16, constitute a propositio, or proposition, an element of a formal argument that Cicero, of course, is aware of, but that is foregrounded much more explicitly by Quintilian in Volume 2 of the Institutio Oratoria. I'd like to suggest, in other words, that Swift draws upon Quintilian as well as Cicero in concocting the modest proposal, and that what Beaumont actually labels the narratio is actually the Quintilian-esque propositio, and then what should be labeled the narratio actually is the second half of what Beaumont calls the exordium. This is, I know, all very wonky rhetorical stuff, but if we're going to talk about Swift's relation to these texts, I think it's worth pointing out. You can see my own revised version of Beaumont's template in Roman numeral 2 on the handout. By staying in his subdisciplinary box, that of rhetoric as opposed to historical analysis, Beaumont, I would say, misses a chance to present a piece of evidence that would strengthen better than any his own vision of the essay's structure as the medium of Swift's formal irony. As Beaumont and other students of the proposal's rhetoric have pointed out, the reprehensio is the section of the essay in which Swift's speaker rejects the vain and visionary ideas regarding the Irish poor suggested by other writers. As mostly literary critics and historians have further pointed out, the vain and visionary ideas, these are Beaumont's words, that the speaker pushes aside are precisely those that Swift himself had recommended in other contexts without irony as methods for alleviating Irish poverty. The upside-down character of the proposer's argument and the formal distance between Swift and his speaker is nowhere clearer than here, where Swift identifies himself directly with the speaker's rejected ideas and then marks them as rejected by placing them in the part of the argument that is, on classical terms, formally identified as waste. It's also worth noting that Swift intensified the reader's attention to his speaker's rejected ideas by having them italicized in the first printing of the essay. Okay, all these points are nothing new. They've all been noted by various commentators on the proposal, but to my knowledge, they've never been brought together under the same critical rubric, and I'm suggesting that they very much should be. They could be recombined here, disciplinarily speaking. Well, given the clear value of the Ciceronian and, I would suggest, Quintilian template in the modest proposal as a device to sharpen Swift's irony, it might seem a little iconoclastic to suggest that the classical structure of the work can be looked at from another direction entirely. But there is evidence that it can be, and I think this evidence is worth examining, even though it's mostly circumstantial and therefore less direct than the evidence that Swift uses the classical format in the proposal as a moral contrast to the speaker's perversion. Despite Swift's attachment to classical rhetoric, and to Cicero in particular, we do find him cautioning a young gentleman against relying on it too much in his letter to a young gentleman lately entered into holy orders from 1721. In this letter, Swift does not specifically warn his addressee away from the kind of argumentative structure I'm discussing here, but he does suggest that the aims of ancient orators, and Cicero in particular, were often to inflame or cool the passions of the audience, and he presents such aims as implicitly base, as well as ineffective when used on phlegmatic listeners from northern climes. Moreover, Swift's canon as a whole suggests that his attitude toward the ancients was not unequivocally approving, and his skepticism about them was something he shared with many whose theology or politics he might otherwise have disliked. As Claude Rawson has observed, Swift and his contemporaries possessed a deep anxiety about the violence of ancient cultures that they so often held up as moral and aesthetic models. The works of Swift and others, says Rawson, are fraught with subtextual anxieties over the morality of war, the ethos of a warrior caste, the uppish aloofness and pride of rank of an aristocratic culture no longer sure of itself. Swift, more specifically, seems to have regarded the licensing of the passions, often brutal in themselves, found in Roman culture and in Roman rhetoric, as involving a level of self-discipline that he considered ethically hypocritical as it pertained to the ancients and recurrently confining as it pertained to himself. What all this suggests is that Swift's use of a rigid classical template in the modest proposal includes that template among the objects of the proposal's irony, while offering it as a measure of that irony at the same time. In other words, Swift's very association of Ciceronian argumentative form with his cannibalistic proposer repudiates the ancients as much as it embraces them. This repudiation is less spectacular and aggressive than, say, Milton's recasting of the goddess Athena as sin in Book 2 of Paradise Lost. But as a rejection, it would have been readily visible to many of Swift's classically trained contemporaries, that is, many of his mostly male readers with the rudiments of a genteel education. The most direct evidence for this possibility is the fact that, on the basis of a very limited preliminary survey, Swift's use of the Ciceronian template in his short, non-ironic proposals is fluid at best. It never rises to the level of rigor and clarity that he employs in the modest proposal, and sometimes it virtually disappears when Swift's feelings about his topic are intense. One can see the Ciceronian model informing Swift's early essays in a more or less uncomplicated way, as in such a work as A Proposal for Correcting, Improving, and Ascertaining the English Tongue from 1712. In this piece, the basic parts of the Ciceronian format are clearly in evidence, and except for the digression, I think, and follow in due course. But two of Swift's later, more polemical essays show him to be more than a skillful rhetorician who accommodates the classical model to his occasional needs. They show that sometimes Swift's subject alters or even forecloses his relationship to some of the template's formal parts. When his authorial feelings run high, the model can warp or even explode because it's subject to argumentative pressures that it can't contain. One can see this most clearly, I think, in his proposal for the universal use of Irish manufacture from 1720. In this essay, Swift's need to protect his identity means, structurally speaking, that he can't begin with a proem that establishes his credentials as a speaker. The piece lurches directly into the narratio, with the propositio closely following. In these sections, Swift asserts that the Irish have stupidly devoted their most arable land to the feeding of sheep, as he puts it. Then he suggests that to compensate for this foolishness, they wear nothing but clothes made from their own wool, since English laws forbid the sale of Irish manufactures in England, and the French markets that have been Ireland's commercial recourse are unreliable. What's most remarkable, I think, about the essay's structure, though, is the way in which it shreds after the proposition. At the end of this section, Swift does make a comment that gestures in the direction of a reprehensio, and he kind of does that. That's going out of order anyway here. But he presents this opposing view as basically ridiculous and frames it with withering sarcasm. I was much delighted with a person, he says, who hath a great estate in this kingdom, upon his complaints to me how grievously poor England suffers by impositions from Ireland. Then he fulminates for the rest of the essay about various manifestations of the oppression of the Irish by the English as well as by the Irish administration. His blasts render the reprehensio and the confirmatio effectively indistinguishable. And the second half of the essay raises issues that are much larger than any entailed in the essay's specific proposal about buying local. One might say that Swift's complaints in the reprehensio cum confirmatio merely shift the essay onto its true topic, the oppressiveness of Anglo-Irish law and of the Irish administration. They burst the essay's Ciceronian seams in the process. As I was writing this, to invoke a pop culture reference, I think of Swift as the Incredible Hulk. You know, he gets really mad and he gets big and then he sort of busts out of his shirt. To use a kind of rhetoric clothing metaphor that I think is also highly appropriate to Swift. It's not difficult to see why the authorities jailed Swift's printer for sedition after the piece appeared, although Edward Waters never gave up Swift's identity as the author, and Swift was always grateful to him for that. It's also not difficult to see why the essay has no peroration at all. Swift has neither the need nor the patience for a gracious retreat. In his last paragraph, he just snorts angrily at the idea of an Irish bank, another bad idea about which he has heard rumors, and then he quits. The essay on Irish manufactures in context suggests that when writing in a formally non-ironic mode, Swift sometimes found the rhetorical model he uses so scrupulously in the modest proposal incompatible with the freewheeling character of his outrage, an unpleasant constraint upon the combative energies that drove his own work. A brief look at a second essay shows that he could find the form to be something of a rhetorical straitjacket even in signed works, where he could at least retain the decencies of an introduction and a peroration. Swift's proposal for giving badges to the beggars is a late piece. It's from 1737. And it's one in which Swift returns to the topic of Irish poverty, which he had treated with such ironic ferocity in the modest proposal in 1729. But by the time of the later essay, he was clearly not just enraged at the level of poverty around him, but exhausted with trying to alleviate it. In the proem of this essay, he asserts his credentials as a longtime member of the Dublin Workhouse Board. In his narratio, he complains that a recent expansion of the board has caused its members to lose their focus on Dublin beggars proper. And in his propositio, he recommends that beggars from Dublin parishes be made to wear badges as licenses to beg, so that beggars from outside Dublin parishes may be driven away or at least ignored. As in his proposal regarding Irish manufacture, Swift launches into an open-ended reprehensio in this essay almost immediately after making his proposal, a proposal, incidentally, that he and other local authorities had promoted for over a decade without getting the poor to cooperate and wear their badges the way they wanted them to. I never heard more than one objection against this expedient, he says. This is his gesture in the direction of a reprehensio, except for the question of how to handle the foreign beggars, that is, those from outside Dublin. Swift's response to this objection is to say that foreign beggars can find relief elsewhere and that they must be driven or whipped out of town. The animus against the non-parochial poor underlying this recommendation excuse me, shapes the rest of Swift's argument, such as it is. In this essay, as in the Irish manufacturer's proposal, the reprehensio defensively appears before the confirmatio, excuse me, and the reprehensio and the confirmatio are lashed together, in this case, by Swift's animosity toward the non-local poor, as well as to the shopkeepers, beadles, and city ministers who failed to drive them away. There is a digression in which Swift sarcastically thanks England for shipping over additional loads of beggars, which he says Ireland would happily return with interest. And there is a depressing and depressive peroration, which basically says, well, you can pay attention to this. Nobody ever listens to me anyway. It's always been my fate, and there, have at it. But the combined reprehensio and confirmatio of this essay is notable not only for what we would call its inhumanity, now anyway, but also for the fact that it consists of only one real position, supported through reiteration, that the non-parochial poor are vermin, and that the Dublin authorities should drive them out of town. Swift's argument is throttled by fatigue and near despair into a single passion. I'll close by offering one final suggestion about the status of the Ciceronian model in Swift's imagination generally and in the modest proposal in particular. As we analyze Swift's use of Cicero in his famous and supposedly perfect ironic satire, we need to recall that the modest proposal is nothing if not a performative work. Swift's proposer is invented primarily by being enacted, more specifically by being crafted out of moral as well as rhetorical self-discipline on the author's part. The evidence provided by Swift's other short essays suggests that Swift equated the rigid use of classical argumentative form, especially on topics about which he felt strongly, with moral self-restraint, and that he saw such moral self-restraint in turn as galling to exhibit under stress, yet is essential to the kind of modesty to which his brutal speaker lays claim in the modest proposal. The sense in which the Ciceronian model is an object of attack in the proposal, then, is very complicated and quite fraught. While that model represents for Swift both rationality and, at least in some sense, good manners, it also enforces a kind of self-directed sadism, which, as Swift shows, can all too easily enable sadism against others as well. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your papers. I'm going to try and stitch them together to continue on with the clothing metaphor. And one way I'm going to try to do that is by thinking about the joke's relation to rhetoric, or the joke's position in rhetoric, either as a device or as a mode of an umbrella term, sort of. So I guess I'm wondering, like, how to take up the description on the Black humor in the U.S. cover of its contents being something terrible and wonderful, which hits my ear as sort of a very sublime kind of designation, which of course has a relation to rhetorical constructions. So I guess I'm wondering, like, how you might think about the rhetoric of humor, particularly as relates to the strong affects that you're designating in Swift's sort of work, which are a part of the author's sort of approach, and it seems less so in your construction, part of the reader's response. And the joke maybe connects those two things, though I'm not sure how. So if any of that strikes you, I'd love to hear more.
Yeah. Do you want to say anything about this first?
I'll start. Thank you. That's a really wonderful question, and I think you're going to allow me to kind of delineate between, in a way, the Black humor of Breton and the dark humor of Freud, because as I said with Freud's example, it is really bound to that situation. And so it's rhetoric within a particular situation, and it's not so much about what is being said. That same sentence in a completely different situation would not have that resonance whatsoever. Whereas Breton, it becomes much more of an ideological posture. It is, for him, the whole Black humor is so anti, right? It is anti-establishment. It is a revolt against the received ideas, the authoritative. And I think it is, I don't want to say romantic, but or post-romantic form of humor in a way that it does reach to the sublime. And I think that the terms that he uses to describe it is very much consistent with that. And I think it's when you said that the sublime is really connected with rhetoric, I was like very connected to the Gothic, right? So I think there's that connection as well. And in the, not to go on too long, but in the preface to the anthology, he takes the image of the lightning rod, which is also revolutionary. That's in David's painting of the Oath of the tennis court, and that atmospheric natural wonder sort of, and that's the image of the jolt that he wants. And so I think he is, so I don't know that I've actually answered the rhetoric side of it, which is where you started. And I guess I haven't thought about it as much simply because it's not there for Breton. You know, I really was focusing on how he locates it in the body, which is what was coming up a lot in yesterday's talks, and specifically in the face and then in the mouth. And it reminded me of Paula's remarks yesterday about the ears and the mouth, and it was really that focusing specifically on Voltaire's mouth as you know, gritting the teeth, or you know, and the teeth being related to this idea of biting or mordant humor, and the irony there being that art historians talk about that Houdon sculptures that he had lost all of his teeth by then. So that's sort of the amazing realism of it. But yeah, thank you.
I
Very
think
interesting.
An excellent question too, and one that I have no easy, ready answer for. I think, especially say in the case of a work like The Modest Proposal, to answer a question like that, you have to deal with this very slippery problem of Swift's irony and what his relationship is to what he's talking about here. And I think there is a very interesting connection. I found it fascinating and appropriate that we're on the same panel here and talking about this, because, I mean, here you have this work that's basically recommending eating babies, I mean, than which nothing could be more gross. And the sublime is known to have a component of the terrifying in it. I mean, to get Edmund Burkean for a second. And if that's something that people perceive as liberating, well, that's quite frightening. But I think my sense is that in the history of the reception of this piece, what people find liberating is the hostility underneath that, even if it is not, even if you don't take literally the proposal, even if you don't identify Swift with the actual content of his proposal, which I think, you know, only the most simple-minded reader could. Although I occasionally have students that have to be reminded about this. It's a little bit terrifying, but so I think part of what I'm trying to get at here is this question of hostility and how it's there, and how there is a sense in which Swift's supposedly perfect irony really isn't. And I mean, this is something that we've all known for some time. There's been a lot of discussion about, well, for a long time, you know, during the Wayne Booth era, this was the perfect ironic black box. There was no way behind it, and so forth. And then people started to talk about Swift's identity as an Irishman and how much he really kind of hated the Irish at some level, but felt that identified with them at the same time, and how all kinds, you know, the Irish are involved in cannibalism historically and all kinds of things like that. Claude Rawson has had so many brilliant things to say about this. But at any rate, it's made the perfectness of the irony crumble over time, or certainly shred and warp. And I think I found it kind of interesting. I think that looking at the structure, which appears to be associated with this model of absolute containment and perfect form and poise and calm and, you know, ancient nobleness and so forth, is, if you look at Swift's relationship to that, I think that's one place in which another place in which you can locate the kind of hostility that really you do find in this work. I think, I mean, part of what I've been trying to get at here is, I know it's kind of the unrecoverable, but it's one of many things that we all reach for, and that's the idea of how Swift felt when he was writing this. You know, what was going through his mind? How was he feeling? And I do sense that he had strapped the mechanism on. You know, there was a sense in which it was something uncomfortable, but to him, but he knew it was appropriate here, because this is all about sadism. You know, and there is a kind of bondage element to this piece that I think it's appropriate to mention.
You know, if I could just follow up for 1 second, because as you were speaking, I was reminded of Ian Higgins' article, a chapter in the recent collection set, Swift's Travels, and he talks specifically about the joke, and he, from the French, it's sort of a faire la blague, and so it's actually very relevant to the Trump era right now, because that's the way that, you know, kind of going back to the panel and the troll, is that you say this horrible thing and then say, oh, no, I'm just joking.
Yeah.
But you really meant it.
It's already out there.
But you're joking. And not so much for a modest proposal, looking at The Shortest Way with the Dissenters. But so there is that rhetorical move of the French fait la blague that is, you say it, and then you say it was a joke, but there's meaning behind it. Yeah.
I think just behind you there.
Those were both great papers. And Beth, I have a question for you. I really love the way you talked about Swift's ambivalence about, or the period's ambivalence, but Swift's specific ambivalence about the classics by focusing on classical rhetorical form. And I thought your Hulk metaphor was really, really brilliant and suggestive. And as you were talking in response to this question, I was thinking a lot about what we've all been trying to wrestle with here, which is this excess and this affect that we all keep responding to, even though we are dealing with texts that, in the case of Modest Proposal, for example, exhibit such amazing restraint while narrating these horrific things, right? So I was thinking about Swift's role in the Ancients and Moderns controversy, and I was thinking especially about the Battle of the Books. Because when you teach that to students, you have to kind of explain to them, well, he is on the side of the ancients here, supposedly, right? But then you get to the spider and the bee, and the spider is the best part, right? I mean, he clearly, I think, loves the spider, right, and loves talking like the spider and cursing and, you know, just sort of letting loose. It seems like, so you're giving me a way to think about other moments where Swift's apparent conservatism and allegiance to a certain idea of order is not necessarily complete. Right. It's another way of thinking about his ambivalence. So I'm really grateful to you for that.
Well, thank you. I do think it's a kind of truism that we all come to from various directions, that Swift is caught up in what he hates. I mean, there are all kinds of
course, yeah,
perspectives through which we, I think, come to this point. But I think very splendidly it's the case in terms of his involvement in print culture, which is something he sends up all over the place and quite clearly. I mean, some of the brilliant papers we've heard here have emphasized the extent to which he's got his nose in this stuff every single day, and cares about it deeply and knows its ins and outs. And I mean, what better thing to satirize than something that you really, really know well? So I think his affiliations with regard to modernity are, yes, very fraught, and I'd say tortured too. Sometimes Swift strikes me more and more as a man who was in a lot of pain, and even before it was the pain that say Catherine was talking about earlier of you know, illness and old age and so forth. There was just a lot of psychic pain that he dealt with on a regular basis, and I think that rendered these various attachments to classicism and modernity all the more fraught.
Well, thank you.
We had one on the other side there.
Hi, and thank you for those. I actually was really struck by Breton's designation of Swift as the most Gothic writer of them all. And the conversation since then has made me think pretty hard about how we usually talk about rhetoric and satire, which is usually via, usually via the medium of irony, and we think about positionality. But I was wondering to what degree it might be useful, especially in the case of Swift, especially given that you were just talking about your nose in you. When you teach the Gothic, one of the first distinctions that you tend to teach undergraduates is the distinction between horror and terror. Horror being that thing that it gives you that bodied or bodily repulsion, that, and terror being sort of the fear of the partially known or the unknown. And here it strikes me as maybe particularly useful for thinking about Swift deals with rhetoric. The thing Modest Proposal does is render something that is unthinkable in great detail. It's sort of not quite terror, but something that is not unknowable, which is another trope you tend to use with the Gothic, into something that is spoken in detail. And I was just wondering whether, I mean, usually we don't think about satirists as Gothic writers, right? And here is a tradition, right? And here's a list. I loved the list on the board. Right, but so I'm putting on my beret, asking to what degree that appropriation might be at least illuminating, if not transformative, and whether either of you, I mean, it is a question directed to you in a way because you brought up, you were the one who raised the issue, but it's also about rhetoric and how do you talk about humor and satire, because we usually don't talk about it in the terms that we usually reserve for Gothic, which are horror, terror, the unspeakable, and yet it strikes me as incredibly useful, especially given how hard it is usually to explain a joke.
And I guess I would just very, very briefly, there's a line that I cut out of my talk that I was going to quote, and I won't be able to exactly hear, but it's something that struck me, and your comment kind of speaks to that, is that the Gothic doesn't allow for distance, whereas irony, of course, puts a distance between meaning and what's said and what's meaning, whereas there's this sort of collapsing of it in the Gothic so that you're immersed and you believe it, right? You give over your suspension of disbelief.
And it's about denying the reader.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, interesting.
I just never thought about it this way. That strikes me as incredibly useful.
Yeah.
Well, I invoked Edmund Burke a minute ago, and I'm wondering if that was entirely appropriate. I think maybe in some ways it is, but if you think of the Burkean sublime, it does involve awe and terror and the grand and the distant and so forth. Whereas, what you have in the Modest Proposal, obviously, is something that's so obviously grotesque and small and close up and right in your face. I mean, you're looking at something that's terrible, not because it's grand, but because it's disgusting. And if it's awe-inspiring, it's only awe-inspiring in terms of what the reaction it produces in the reader with regard to this speaker and what this speaker is capable of. So it kind of folds back on itself. So I'm not, in other words, I'm not really sure how to answer your question. It's just to say that maybe, yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
I think we have time for one more. Yeah.
This is just a small point. Maybe the sublimity is Kantian sublimity in the quantification that the Swift undertakes in Modest Proposal in imagining how much food will be supplied from the children and what it adds up quickly.
Mathematical sublimity.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
I think we can fit one more just in. Yeah.
Very quick, very specific, but I think that the sublime is supposed to put you in the world of the irrational. I think what's terrifying about the proposal is that it's so rational and rationally argued and reasoned and so on. But I wanted to ask, another explanation of the Gothic that I am familiar with is not so much that it celebrates the barbarian, but that it's as a terrifying thing or a chaotic thing, but that it focuses on the fact that these Goths came down and disrupted the empire. So it has a different political read in that respect, or it could. And the other quick question I wanted to ask you, and then I'll stop, is we're speaking of clothing metaphors, can you explain that bra that was, that image from the collection, the anthology, the box with the bra hanging out of it?
Yeah, getting back to Sadian.
Yes, I just couldn't help but ask. We've been very visual at this conference.
Since, she's speaking, but yeah.
Or is it just your standard lascivious gesture of the
Yeah,
60s? I think it's
they're just finding a secret place, and the clothing came off.
But, you know, I mean, we could get into Druidian crypt that it both conceals and reveals, and here's her, what should be concealed is revealing what's going
One thing
on.
I will say that I was thinking as you were talking about, you know, Breton's emphasis on the revolutionary, and there's a sense in which, I mean, if you want to take what I suggest here about Swift kind of rebelling against the classical format, that's there here too. That there's a sense in which that's part of the locus of whatever terror there is in the Modest Proposal, the idea that somehow these classical constraints aren't doing what they're supposed to, that they're no longer working, they're no longer effective.
Well, thank you both so much.